Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have until what time? Till what, 5:30 or?
We have till 6, but we're hoping to do the speech until 5:30.
No, I'm not going to actually. I wanted to primarily have a question and answer and a discussion. So I'll just give a very brief couple of points that I think should inform our discussion, and then the majority of our time we can actually have with a discussion of issues that are relevant to belief in God. But to begin the discussion, I want all of us to think of the title that I was given of this session, Does God Matter? And to try to reach a resolution of the question, should we be asking, does God matter? Or should we be asking, do we matter? Or does anything else aside from God matter? And that has several prerequisites that we have to first get through before we can actually think of and try to answer that question. First of all, does God exist? Second of all, if God does exist, then how are we to approach God and understand God or recognize God? And third of all, what effect should that have in our life? Right? Does that mean that then God is to be given primacy? Or that we are to be still the center of our universe and then we are reaching out to God? What is the creational reality of our existence? Now, I'm not looking for us to get a definitive answer to that question. If we look at it from a Gnostic perspective, we will get certain insights. If we look at it from a more intellectual or discursive perspective, we'll get different insights. But the issue that we should be trying to gain a bit of a grasp on is, once a person believes in God, what is the relationship between an individual and God? And who has the primacy in that relationship? And so that should be a question, and we can talk about it, but it should be something actually that we leave this session also with the question still in our minds, not necessarily with an answer, of how that relation is to exist, and what lessons can we learn from the examples of religious traditions in history, or the different streams of human thought that bear on this topic. To help us in understanding that question, there's a couple things that I think it's good for us to think about. The first is, and I hope that we're not going to be talking today primarily about whether God exists. We'll assume that we've moved beyond that and we're talking about, well, does God matter? But when we're talking about the essence of God or the existence of God, the relevant question or perspective is not for us to think of it as an intellectual puzzle that we're trying to solve, as a theoretical matter. When we think of the existence or the non-existence of something, then we're thinking of it in terms of whether we are trying to prove or disprove something. There is a reality, and we're trying to find out what that reality is. The relevant question to be asking, and this is something which we can say from an Islamic perspective, is not to solve the theoretical question of whether God exists, but to make a decision on what basis we are to lead our lives. What is the most reasonable and the most wise basis for me as an individual, for all of us, to lead our lives according to? And the reason for that change in perspective, if we want to simplify it, is that whenever we're dealing with an objective reality that we're trying to either prove or disprove, the more we find out, the more we actually realize how little we know. Right? If any of you have ever studied any of the intellectual or the rational proofs for God's existence that have been offered by Islamic thinkers, Christian theologians, or any other thinker or philosopher in history or in contemporary times, I'm not sure if any of you have studied any of those proofs, read through them, found objections, tried to answer objections. But one thing that does come to perhaps many of our minds is, this proof that I've read, it seems quite conclusive. And for 600 years, people thought that this was a definitive proof of God's existence. And then some philosopher in some corner or some village somewhere in the world came up with an objection. And then for a period of time, philosophers no longer considered that proof to be complete. And then another philosopher or another thinker may have come and expanded on or completed that proof. And then they're developed, they're changed. The question that comes to a person's mind, and it's a valid question, is I'm not the smartest person who ever existed, or the sharpest mind that ever existed. So even if I'm convinced, how much stock can I place in my being convinced by this proof? Is that something that I can actually think is conclusive just because I happen to be convinced? If I were a bit smarter, maybe I wouldn't be convinced. The process of trying to discover objective reality is a process that opens us up to ever-increasing doubt because we realize how much broader our horizons need to be than they have been in the past. And that's a proper and a justifiable response to the recognition of the limitations of our observations and the limitations of our mental faculties. But from the perspective of religion, whether it be Islam or any other religion, the obligation of recognizing or serving God is not something which was only intended to belong to the sharpest and the smartest minds in history. It's something which was to be applied to all of humanity. And so the basic reality of that relationship between God and man, or between God and the individual, it can't be based primarily on that discursive, theoretical manner of approach. Does that make sense, or do I need to expand on it? If that were the primary manner of understanding or approaching God, or of answering the question about whether God exists even, then the expectation would be that religions would only say people who are at that pinnacle of intellectual development and perfection, they are responsible for either accepting or not accepting religion. But when we come to the question of what decision should I make in life, what should be the basis of my own existence and the decisions that I make in how to lead my life, then that is a framework that allows for uncertainty, but it's a process where we're trying to figure out what is the best way for us to deal with the limitations of our knowledge, our mental abilities, in order to be able to make the correct decision or the best decision that we are capable of making. So it's a process, it's a framework that goes towards certainty, if it is possible in certain instances. And if certainty is not attainable, then at the very least towards being able to reach a decision, to being able to reach closure. And that is something which every human being is capable of doing, with our different levels of mental abilities, our different levels of intellectual ability. So the actual question that we should be asking ourselves is, not whether I can intellectually prove or disprove the existence of God, but what is the most logical, not logical in a purely theoretical sense, but what is the most reasonable basis for me to lead my life according to, from here on out? Is it a life that is based on faith or a life that is not based on faith? That changes the types of arguments and the types of questions that we will be asking and the way that we go about answering those questions. When we want to find out theoretically who is the most competent doctor in the United States, we will be asking a certain set of questions and analyzing what we learn in a certain way. And if we're trying to figure out how to cure a sickness that we know that we have, and we obviously want to get the best treatment available to us, then we're going to be asking a different set of questions, and we're going to be trying to resolve that question in a different way. Because in the end, we want the treatment. That's what's important for us. So if we approach spirituality in that way, then a lot of times it makes the path a lot easier, and it allows a person to answer the question effectively. That's the first thing that we need to be thinking about, is what is the framework that we should be searching for God, or the answer to the question about God's existence and His essence and His attributes according to.